You know, there is a reason why so many Ocarina of Time retrospectives and video essays start with this opening. It's iconic, enchanting, and it manages to set the tone of the game perfectly. It's not often when you find a game as good as this one. It has stood the test of time to the point that when I played this game for the first time in 2024, 26 years after it was made, it still became not only one of my favorite Zelda games, but one of my favorite games ever made. Just like me, many other people love this game, even going as far to say that it is better than games like GTA 5, Resident Evil 4, and Breath of the Wild. Today, I'm going to talk about why people like this game as much as they do. Ocarina of Time was a very ambitious game for the time. It was the first ever 3D Zelda game. Before this, all we had was Zelda 1, 2, A Link to the Past, and Link's Awakening. Whilst Nintendo was perfectly able to implement their other main franchise, Mario, into a 3D world, would they be able to do the same to Zelda? It was hard enough at the time trying to make a platformer that included the Z-axis, but trying to make a Zelda game like this was something else entirely. The developers of Mario 64 were able to get away with not making that big of a game because one of the main things that makes Mario games so fun is going back to replay the levels that you have already beaten. The Zelda team, on the other hand, had to design a combat system that would feel nice to control, a whole overworld, 9 dungeons plus 3 mini-dungeons, create a story that was connected to other Zelda titles, and design many different items that would all impact gameplay differently to one another. And don't take this as me hating on Mario 64. I really like that game. In fact, most of the things that I just mentioned, the Mario team also had to do something similar as well. But I believe Ocarina of Time had a lot more to do than Mario 64. According to some research that I did, Ocarina of Time was Nintendo's largest game at the time, coming out to be 32 megabytes, whilst Mario 64 was only 8 megabytes. Somehow, with all that Ocarina of Time had to do, it still managed to do a lot of things better than most games can do today. From the very start of the game, Ocarina of Time starts teaching the player gameplay mechanics. You are tasked to speak with the Great Deku Tree, however Mido decides to completely block off Link's path until Link shows him that he has a sword and a shield. If you start exploring the starting area of the Kokiri Forest, you will quickly find the shield being sold at a shop for 40 rupees. Forcing the player to get 40 rupees makes it so that the player will learn things about the game. The Kokiri Forest is kind of like a little playground, letting you experiment with what this world can and won't let you do. And as you explore, you may find this little area where the sword is located. I remember exploring every little part of this place and crossing off things from a list that I had made in my head until I eventually found the sword. By the time I had gotten the sword, I was only a few rupees away from getting the shield. In my opinion, this is one of the best introductions to any video game, because it lets the player explore but also makes it easy for the player to find where to go. After this introduction to the game, the player can now enter the Great Deku Tree, which is the first dungeon of the game. The first 3 dungeons of this game, also known as the Child Dungeons, are a lot simpler. These dungeons slowly introduce the player to different gameplay mechanics until the player finishes all 3 of them, at which point they are ready to take on the adult dungeons of the game. This is something that I love about Ocarina of Time. The game's pacing is one of the main things that just makes the game so good. I've never felt like something was slowing me down from progressing the game, and every area was somehow at the perfect amount of difficulty. It's kind of weird that this game is paced so well. Like, this was one of the first ever Zelda games, and despite that, Zelda games that came out multiple years later can still not get pacing right. Each child dungeon slowly gets a little bit more challenging in terms of puzzles than the last. The Great Deku Tree is extremely linear, only having you go back to an area you've already been twice, assuming that you don't go out of your way to explore an optional room. The puzzles of this dungeon couldn't get much simpler. You will find puzzles here as simple as lighting all of the torches in a room, jumping down into a web in order to break it, and defeating all of the enemies in a room to open a locked door. Dodongo's Cavern is a step up from the Great Deku Tree in terms of combat encounters. The cavern has a lot of enemies which use fire, which encourages the player to use the Hylian shield as the Deku shield is made of wood. However, at this point in the game, Link can't use the Hylian shield effectively, and that removes the ability to walk whilst using the shield. This, mixed with the fact that you must fight the King Dodongo and 2 Lizalfos twice, makes it quite a step up from Goma in the Deku Tree. It's still easy because, well, it's one of the first areas of the game, but it is harder than the Deku Tree. Some of the more notable puzzles include having to wait for this bomb to nearly explode before throwing it, because it is extremely hard to get it on this tiny ledge, and having to drop a bomb in each eye of this Dodongo's skull. The next dungeon in the game after Dodongo's cabin is inside Jabu Jabu's belly. This dungeon focuses a lot more on puzzles, and in terms of that, it is the hardest child dungeon in the game. From the start, it tests if the player understands the slingshot by putting a switch above Link that the player needs to hit to open the door. It does this because the item of this dungeon is the boomerang, which acts like the slingshot. This dungeon has the gimmick of needing to carry Princess Ruto around. The dungeon makes great use of this mechanic, which is seen in this room, where you first must stand on a switch with Ruto to get the boomerang, and then leave Ruto on another switch to defeat this enemy. At this point, the player is really tested on their memory of the dungeon layout. When you enter back in this room, you will notice that 2 doors that were previously blocked off are now open. Now what you have to do is obvious. Defeat 1 more of these enemies to access the final door. However, once you defeat this enemy and enter this room, you will notice that there is another one of those enemies. Now the player might get confused by this and question what the point of the room was. Well, if they remember too early in the dungeon where there was another blocked off area, they will be able to progress. Through the methods like this, Jabu Jabu's belly is able to test the player on their memory and puzzle solving abilities, which is fitting knowing that this is the last child dungeon of the game. Now before I talk about the adult dungeons, I want to talk about the world of this game and also the main gameplay mechanics. I kinda skipped over this because I wanted to show how the child dungeons slowly get harder and harder and prepare the player for the adult dungeons. So after you leave the Kokiri Forest, you are met by this. And yeah, it's completely empty. It was 1998, and whilst Hyrule Field might feel empty today, it was a big deal at the time. The N64, which is the console this game originally released on, used cartridges that could store up to 64 megabytes of data. I mentioned earlier that Ocarina of Time took up half of this at 32 megabytes. Other consoles at the time, like the PS1 and Dreamcast, used CDs, and because of this, games on those consoles had a lot more storage space to work with. Despite this, Ocarina of Time had one of the biggest worlds of any 3D game at the time. For example, Sonic Adventure 1 had a much smaller world, even though it had a whole gigabyte to work with on the Dreamcast. So fitting a map like this into 32 megabytes seemed impossible, but Nintendo proved that it was possible with this game. At first, Hyrule Field might seem empty, but the more you play the game and the more you progress, you will realize that there is quite a bit to do in this world. As normal, there are heart pieces to collect and side quests to complete. There are only a few side quests, however they are very long and have very good rewards like the Big Goron Sword and Epona. There are also mini-games which act as fun little activities to do in between different segments of the game. The towns and cities of this game are populated by many NPCs. Almost every single one has something unique to say, and a lot of which have interesting lore. There are also the Golden Skulltulas. These are enemies littered across Hyrule that drop tokens when defeated. When you get enough tokens, you can get a reward from the Skulltula house. These are like Korok seeds from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but in this game they're actually fun to collect because the rewards are good, unlike one more inventory space. Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda game, and because of that, it had a lot of weight on its shoulders to implement Link moving, solving puzzles, and fighting in a 3D environment. The game's combat is quite simple. Of course, they didn't want to make it so complex that one little overlook would ruin the entire system. But simple doesn't necessarily mean bad. Almost every 3D Zelda game after this one uses a similar combat system with some small additions. Ocarina of Time's combat is inspired by Japanese sword fighting cinema, otherwise known as Chanbara. I probably pronounced that wrong. In these cinemas, the protagonist would often fight multiple opponents at once. The cameraman would make this more cinematic by focusing the camera on the protagonist as they fought one opponent, and then refocusing it on the protagonist when they would go on to fight another opponent. This is what Z-targeting was based on. If you don't know, Z-targeting is a mechanic that lets the player focus on one target at a time, as well as move the camera behind the player without the use of a second stick. Many games, like the Souls games for example, have used this mechanic, and there is a reason for that. This mechanic basically solved the issue of cameras in games that have an emphasis on combat and aren't shooters. When you target an enemy in Ocarina of Time, other enemies stop attacking you. Zelda games are less focused on combat and rather have an emphasis on puzzle solving and exploring, so having enemies stop attacking you when you target onto a different one is a very good addition. Whilst the sword and shield are the main things that are going to get you through most combat encounters, this game does make a good use of other items in the game. For example, some enemies are high up and need to be attacked at range, and some enemies can only be damaged by bombs. So far, we have had the Great Deku Tree, which acts as a tutorial for the game, Dodongo's Cavern, which tested the player's combat skills, and Jabu Jabu's Belly, which tested the player's puzzle solving and backtracking skills. This then leads to the adult dungeons of the game, which are much more difficult than the child dungeons. This is one of the ways that Ocarina of Time gets pacing right. By having the child dungeons at the start of the game, Ocarina of Time can slowly ease the player into completing dungeons until they are ready for the adult dungeons. The first adult dungeon of the game is the Forest Temple, and I think this dungeon might be one of the best in any Zelda game. Unlike the child dungeons, this dungeon has a clear goal that is made obvious to the player from the very start. Defeat 4 ghosts to light 4 torches. What I like most about this temple is the fact that it doesn't let you light any torch in any order. This is something that I think modern Zelda dungeons struggle with. If this dungeon were to let you get any torch in any order, then it would feel like just a set of puzzles that you had to complete with no connection to one another. I also like how this dungeon uses its dungeon item, the bow, and keys to make the player backtrack into different areas. This dungeon really struggled with puzzles, however it made up for it by testing how well the player remembered the dungeon layout. This dungeon also makes good use of combat encounters with the Stalfos and Phantom Cannon. Having the bow in this dungeon was a great idea as it lets the player use more combat options as soon as they become Adult Link. The Fire Temple has the gimmick of freeing Gorons so that you can get the keys and eventually get the boss key. Because of this, the Fire Temple can be unique with its puzzles, using things like traps and the item of the dungeon, the Megaton Hammer. Having a lot of keys in this dungeon also makes it quite complicated for backtracking. The Forest and Fire Temples are very similar in terms of difficulty because you can do them in any order. Because these dungeons are towards the middle of the game, it paces the game well. However, I can't say the same for the Water Temple. The Water Temple is such a big step up from the Fire and Forest Temple that it honestly feels like it should have been after the Shadow Temple and maybe even the Spirit Temple. However, you cannot do the Shadow or Spirit Temple without first entering the Water Temple. The Water Temple has you lowering and raising the water level of this main room to get through the dungeon. There are 3 problems with this. Firstly, having to keep the dungeon layout in your head is very difficult for this dungeon. You also must go into your inventory and equip the Iron Boots or Kokiri Boots every single time you want to float to the top of the water or sink to the bottom. Yes, every time unless you're on the 3DS version. The third problem is this key. It is extremely difficult to find this key without a guide unless you're on the 3DS version of the game, where the cutscene makes it more obvious that you can enter this room. The cutscene in the original version of this game does not make it obvious that you can enter this room. I think this dungeon would have been good if those last 2 problems were fixed, and if it was later in the game. I think it would have been fine to have a dungeon this difficult as long as it does not interrupt the pacing of the game. This dungeon is the one area of the game that I think is paced poorly. The dungeon is the hardest in the game and there are still 2 other dungeons after it plus Ganon's castle. I find it weird that the Spirit and Shadow Temples can't be completed before the Water Temple, because other than the Water Temple, each dungeon slowly gets more difficult, which is what makes the pacing of this game so good. The Shadow Temple conflicts me a little bit. On one side I have a dungeon that is filled with interesting puzzles and many areas requiring backtracking skills. But then on the other side I have to guess where to use the Lens of Truth to find these puzzles. I find it annoying that this dungeon uses the Lens of Truth so much, because how am I supposed to know that there is a hidden block here unless I randomly decide to use the Lens of Truth? Other than things like this, the Shadow Temple is pretty good. It has a maze-like design, and I found many of the puzzles to be interesting. I really like these Silver Rupee challenges as they require you to get to different areas of a room. This then helps the player remember the room and even where it's located in the dungeon in case they need to backtrack. And finally we have the Spirit Temple, which is the last dungeon in the game, not counting Ganon's castle. This dungeon is probably my favorite in the game just because of the way it is presented. You have to do part of the dungeon as Child Link until you get the Silver Gauntlets and have to return as Adult Link. I find the first half of this temple to be very fun because you have to fight enemies that you would normally fight as Adult Link, but you have to fight them with your weak weapons and items from the start of the game. I think having the mini-boss being the Iron Knuckle was such a good idea because it makes the player feel like they have gotten much stronger as they've played more of the game, because when you return as Adult Link you have to fight multiple Iron Knuckles. I really like how the puzzles in this dungeon make use of the Mirror Shield. Like when I think about puzzles in Zelda games, I think about the Mirror Shield and the Spirit Temple. There are only a few segments of backtracking in this temple, however it is made up for with having to return as an adult. I assume the reason why this dungeon doesn't use backtracking too much is because of having to do half of the dungeon as a child. You can't really have a dungeon overlap on itself if part of the dungeon is designed to be solved with completely different items. I think that might be the one problem with this temple, but other than that it is pretty much perfect. On paper, the story of Ocarina of Time is very simple, however if you go much deeper and analyze it, you realize it is much more complex. It is a story about growing up and the changes that come with it. During the Child Link section of the game, everything seems to be happy. There are some dark moments, but for the most part everything seems to be good. The music in pretty much every area of the game is happy. Take Hyrule Castle Town for example. As a kid, the town is lively with energy, the residents in the town are dancing, and the music sounds like this. Then, partway through the game, after Ganon appears and tricks Link into spending 7 years standing still, you return to the castle town, and are met by this. The buildings are destroyed, the people are now re-dead, and as they scream at you, you will realize that the music is replaced with the sound of the wind. If you decide to go to the castle now, you see this. What was once populated with lively and happy people is now deserted, with nothing but destroyed buildings, monsters, and a gloomy castle overlooking the town. This is one example of how Ocarina of Time tells its story. It uses music and visuals, and whilst it does showcase the occasional cutscene, it still for the most part tells its story by letting the player observe what is happening. In real life, when we are younger, we often only see the good side of things, and sometimes even ignore the bad things. But when we get older and learn more about the world, we realize that things are more depressing than they may seem. This is the message that Ocarina of Time can convey with its story. A lot of areas in Ocarina of Time have things that seem normal as a child, but become a lot more messed up when you return as an adult. When you go to Lon Lon Ranch as a child, you meet Talon and his daughter Malon. These two basically run the ranch, while this man named Ingo works for Talon and cleans the place. When you come here as an adult, Ingo now owns the place and Malon works for him. Malon says that if she doesn't do what Ingo wants, then Ingo will treat the horses badly. Ingo is now extremely greedy, not even letting Link leave when he loses a bet against Link for Epona. If you go back to Kakariko Village, you will see Talon again, who has been kicked out of the ranch by Ingo and is now forced to be away from his daughter. The only part of the game that doesn't follow this pattern are the dungeons. All of them have this creepy vibe to them. This is because Ganondorf has done some evil in every temple except the Shadow Temple. Despite this, even the Shadow Temple is creepy because it was once used as a torture prison that the royal family used to get information out of people during the Hyrule Civil War. Having dungeons like this builds up Ganondorf as a powerful force. This is probably one of my favorite depictions of the King of Evil. He literally has the Triforce of Power, so having him do things such as putting a race on the brink of extinction, cursing the Great Deku Tree, and reviving a dead dragon really makes him seem powerful. When you finally start walking up the stairs to get to Ganon, and the music grows louder and louder as the suspense grows more and more, you are met by this. The importance of this fight is immediately set. If Link and Zelda lose, then Ganondorf will not only keep the Triforce of Power, but he will also gain the Triforce of Courage and Wisdom. Ganondorf takes Navi away from you and you are forced to fight the boss without being able to target him. The first phase is a game of energy tennis. It is very simple and he only has a few attacks. However, I feel that the first phase just acts as a filler before the second phase. Once you defeat him, he lays on the ground completely still and the castle starts to crumble. Link and Zelda make it down the castle as fast as they can. Once they reach the bottom, the castle fully collapses. Zelda starts saying, "It's over," but it's not. Link moves towards the rubble as a ring of fire emerges and Ganondorf jumps out of the rubble. He starts to transform into Ganon and the Master Sword is taken away from you in this fight. If you have the Bigoron Sword, you can use that, otherwise you must use other equipment such as the Megaton Hammer. I think letting the player use the Bigoron Sword for this fight was very nice because it is such a great reward for such a long side quest. The fight has you simply rolling under Ganon or strafing around him to attack his tail. Eventually, Ganon falls to the ground and the Ring of Fire disappears, letting Link grab the Master Sword again. After going back and doing the same process as before, Ganon is stunned for one last moment as Zelda attacks him with a beam of light. And finally, with a couple swings of the Master Sword, Link defeats Ganon. The sages then seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm and Zelda meets up with Link for one last time to play the Song of Time so that he can get his childhood back, putting an end to the game. 2 games down and they're both in S tier.